think typically diachronically. We think synchronically, one time slice. So think of the present as the top time slice. That's how people normally think of humans when they talk about universal human rights. They're thinking of humans synchronically. The problem with that is it's not taking evolutionary biology seriously. Yes, there's a synchronic dimension, but evolution is diachronic. So if we're going to say humans and only humans have natural rights, we have to go back in time. Now I had another diagram about, it's not going to work because I don't have a document camera here. Another diagram illustrating the human family tree, with lots of branching. Neanderthals were a sister species that went extinct 30,000 years ago. Did Neanderthals have human rights? They were part of the genus Homo, but they weren't part of Homo sapiens, our species. All sorts of complexities and problems rise once one takes evolutionary biology seriously. When did human rights begin? 200,000 years ago? That's as far back as anatomically modern humans go. 300,000 years ago? 500,000 years ago? Do we still want to say equal human rights? The concept only makes sense if we're thinking synchronically. Once we start thinking diachronically, our perspective becomes very different, and all talk of universal human rights seems incredibly arbitrary. Completely arbitrary. Right. And one could add to this a thought experiment. What if all previous organisms, or at least representatives of previous species, came into existence right now? There'd be a Homo erectus there, a Homo habilis there, a Neanderthal there, something a little bit earlier than Cro-Magnon, anatomically modern humans. It would really create serious problems for the concept of universal human rights. It would completely confound people in terms they wouldn't know what to call human and what not to call human. That's what human rights language needs, though. Now, when we go back and look at the early thinkers in terms of universal human rights, we find further problems. First of all, they were creationists. God created humans, and so it was natural for them to combine creationism with universal human rights. They were also typically essentialists, that God made everybody, all humans, with an underlying causal essence. Now, why not simply base universal human rights on the original foundation? One problem is Darwin. It's typically been said that Darwin killed essentialism. Biology is statistical, not essentialistic. Another problem is theology itself. Preaching to the choir here, as the saying might go. Theology itself is enormously problematic. Enormously problematic. Without even getting into arguments for God's existence, here are some facts. The higher the IQ, the less religious belief. So you look at Mensa, as Dawkins points out, a number of studies have shown that the higher the IQ, the less religious belief. Another one is education. The higher the education, typically the less religious belief. The National Academy of Sciences, in the United States, the elite scientists, they did a study group by group. The mathematicians had the highest percentage of theological belief, and that was 13 or 14%. And the biologists did the lowest, which is 5%. Another interesting statistic is that when one looks at country after country after country and social programs, typically the countries with the most social programs have the least religious belief. Right? So Sweden has the most atheists and agnostics. This is from an article in the Cambridge Companion to Atheism. Simply taking the surface facts into account makes the theological foundation of universal human rights problematic. Now Locke himself, I'm not going to have time to get into whether he was an essentialist or not, but he did argue that all humans are created by God. Even though we're not physically equal, he said, obviously we're not physically equal, we're still morally equal. There is a kind of essentialism in John Locke's writings. If not a species essentialism, an essentialism granted by God as our maker. Now Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man, 1791, he's more explicit in his essentialism. He says every generation is equal in rights to the generations which preceded it. And it doesn't matter, he says, whether we're talking about the first generation of humans or the present generation of humans. They're all the same. There's no concept of evolutionary biology in Thomas Paine. No concept of evolutionary change in the human species. Pure creationism combined with essentialism. So he says, the origin of man is the same as the origin of his rights. And of course he quotes Genesis. Let us make man in our own image, says God. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. So says Paine. There you go. The distinction of sexes is pointed out, but no other distinction is even implied. Apparently he didn't read the Adam and Eve story. He's gerrymandering. He's picking and choosing what fits his view and ignoring what doesn't. Okay, so what are we to do if we give up the belief in universal human rights? What's left? Let the human world go to hell in a handbasket or something like that? No, there are a number of possibilities here, and the one I'm going to focus on is utilitarianism. We look at the classical utilitarians, in particular Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Very interesting to look at what they said about natural human rights. Now, utilitarians historically have been reformers, social reformers, not ivory tower philosophers, ivory tower thinkers. Social reformers. That's on their side in this debate. Jeremy Bentham in the early 1800s called the idea of natural rights nonsense upon stilts. What a great line. What a great phrase. Nonsense upon stilts. It's a very high-minded idea, but it's nonsense. John Stuart Mill, his main successor, argues that morality is not based on any concept of innate human rights. It's based on utility, maximizing pleasure, utilitarian calculus. But he does say that if people did believe in human rights, it would tend to increase happiness in society. Is he advocating a useful fiction in that passage? Possibly. Possibly. I've read that passage over and over and over again. And he's not very clear on exactly what he's advocating when it comes to human rights. Anyway, Peter Singer, the most famous, the best exponent of utilitarianism, one might argue, he's certainly the dean of practical or applied ethics. He put applied ethics or practical ethics on the map. He's huge, absolutely huge, beginning mainly with his book Animal Liberation in 1975. Now his argument, though, is utilitarian, but it's not about maximizing pleasure / happiness. A lot of people, like Tom Reagan, argue against utilitarianism because it would result in social injustice. The arguments against utilitarianism are typically against what's known as positive utilitarianism, classical utilitarianism, maximizing pleasure, happiness. One doesn't have to read Singer much to see he's not a positive utilitarian. He's a negative utilitarian.